First of all, I want to, say hi to everybody. Thank you for watching, and this is gonna blow up fast. So we might as well make something good out of it. So I want to say hi and thank you to Vlad and Alex for trying to make this class happen at European Bar School. Unfortunately, we canceled it, but we will do it again once we can. So to start, so we're going to be talking about the history of bartending, but in order to get to the history of bartending, we're supposed to touch base on some things that happened before and how we got to the point where we are now. So basically, that's what this class is going to be about. And we're going to start with the Ottoman Empire. So for people that are not sure, or maybe less familiar, or maybe your mind kind of goes somewhere else at some points, the Ottoman Empire was probably one of the strongest dynasties, strongest ruling dynasties which we have seen in this world. They started at the end of the 13th century, very end, so we can basically say beginning of 14th till the end of or beginning of 20th century. So it's 600 years of their rule. So basically, why is this important? It's very important because the Ottomans ruled for like 600 years. And let's find out more about them and what they are. So basically, at the top of the Ottoman Empire, it was a sultan. So the sultan was like the main ruler. He controlled everything. The sultan would rule religiously and politically. So there was no separation of church and the governing body. So that's what the sultan was doing, and basically through generations, Ottoman Empire was getting stronger and stronger, and basically going through Europe and going through northern part of Africa. So now we're gonna see how that whole thing and how our craft actually developed from what was going on in Europe, because obviously the European settlers came into Americas, into Plymouth when the Pilgrims came, and that's when we started having what was kind of done, not so much, but in a way, yes. So we're going to talk about them. So basically the Sultan ruled, and it was the first and the oldest son that would rule. Before, how they had it was a very rigorous politics. So basically before, all the younger brothers and whoever could have inherited the power, they were either thrown in jail or killed. So basically it was a very ruthless rule, and probably that's why the Ottoman Empire extended as it did. So why is this important? It's important because Suleiman the Great in the 16th century of the Ottoman rule, what he did was he was making small little taverns along the side of the empire as the empire was growing towards Spain in Europe, right? So you go through Greece and then Balkans and then the peninsula, and then you're going to Spain, and then you have obviously the northern part of Africa. So why that was important was because those taverns were basically the birth, or basically was the start of what we have now and what the craft is now today. Why that was, so he was making taverns obviously for travelers, salesmen, soldiers, when they were passing by, to have like a rest, to actually have a place where they can actually stop and have a drink and obviously maybe get some information or whatever. But the main thing at the time that was drank at those taverns was coffee. So at the time there wasn't still, so it all developed. It came from coffee, then fermented beverages, then alcohol, and then cocktails, and so on and so forth. So in the beginning it was coffee. So coffee was consumed in those little taverns. And those taverns were not so much as a social gathering, which it became later on. It was more of a gathering of people that wanted some rest, the people that wanted to have a coffee and just move on with their travels or whatever they were doing, right, trading. So why is this important is because later on, which we will get there, we're just gonna figure out more the Ottoman Empire and how it was later on. The culture of that, like the culture of tattooing or anything, expanded, and it expanded in the 17th century in the European parts of it all, where it started to be more, coffee, pastries, and so on and so forth, and fermented drinks, and from there it kind of went and came to the Americas, yes? So basically, we talked about the Iron Rule, of course, and all the political power. it wasn't just as that. Basically, what the Ottoman Empire was doing, it was also, full of art, full of things that was kind of gotten from each and every culture. So it was basically also a time of when cultural and everything was kind of intertwining. Of course, under the rule of Ottoman Empire. Basically what they were doing and why Ottoman Empire was so strong. So basically around the 14th century they developed a thing called Drinkery, which we call in Serbian, I'm not sure the pronunciation in English, but they are basically the Christian population that was taken and was made into like a soldier for the Ottoman Empire, or however the Ottoman Empire saw that child fit in. So basically, as they were taken as like little children, kids, and then eventually they grew up into being something in the Ottoman Empire in order for the Ottoman Empire to rise as well. So we touched base on the taverns, which was important. The Battle of Vienna was when Ottoman was kind of like falling down. So in the Battle of Vienna, Polish, Lithuanian, Czech, Germans, Austrians, that whole center part of Europe was involved, and that's basically when Ottoman Empire started to crash and fall down. That wasn't its fall down, but it was the beginning, as they say. The developing of the American trade and the Caribbean trade and how that went was also weakening them, and the Industrial Revolution as well. So basically a lot of things that were happening were weakening the Ottoman Empire, but they also brought something to the culture as well. Coffee, they brought in, obviously the Arab trade brought in the sugar, or the cane, which we will talk about in the next class. The next class is going to be rum history, so we're going to talk about how that whole transition with sugar and sugar cane actually came to be about, and how the Caribbeans went into what they went. And then we're going to touch base from that story how American independence came into play, and taxation without representation, and how that whole thing about Boston Tea Party and the taxation of molasses came to be about. So if you stick to, we're gonna try and get all of that together. So for now, we're just gonna touch base on this. Obviously, in the 1830 Greece, so the early part of Europe got independent, and then 1878 Serbia got independent from the Ottoman Empire as well. So it was a big transition and a big period for the whole region, the whole culture. How are we doing, Sean? We good? Everybody can hear and stuff like that?
Yep.
Oh, we're not? Okay. Okay.
You can't give them everything.
No? Okay. No, but you can put it back, bro. It's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
Keep live going?
Yeah, keep live going. Yeah. Yeah, we can keep live going. Live is going?
Live is going.
Okay, cool. What didn't they hear from live? When did we cut?
Go back like 3 sentences talking about.
Are we still on live?
We're still on live.
Okay. So what didn't we get? The point of the course. So the point of the course is basically, or the class is, so what the Ottoman Empire did and how it went, and then obviously the Arab trade and how they were bringing in sugar and the cane, and then obviously Christopher Columbus, what we did with what happened with the Caribbean, and then the independence of America. So we're kind of all gonna combine it all into basically what will turn into the history of bartending, or how our craft developed in such conditions. We mentioned the taverns. So the taverns we mentioned as people were. So obviously you had tavern keepers. You had people that were neglecting taverns and actually taking care of them and ordering and then making sure the coffee comes and that there's enough coffee and so on and so forth. Music obviously wasn't a thing back then. Just later on, which we will touch about, when beer gardens started to rise up. That's when the music and entertainment and cockfighting and even like wrestling and things like that came into play. So like, how you call it, restaurants, or actually bars or beer gardens at the time would have an entertainment segment of it as well. So we touched base that the Ottoman Empire actually contributed, obviously through math, through a lot of different arts and linguistic things that they brought in from the East, of course, as well as a lot of help in medicine and a lot of equipment that we use till now in medicine actually came from there. So like we touched base, obviously from all these taverns came to be about. So basically I touched base, I don't know if we were live on Instagram at the time, but Greece, I believe, got independent in 1830. Let me double check, I think that is true. 1830, yes. And then Serbia got independent in 1878. So at that time, obviously the tavern culture already kind of began to uplift and take its course from the beginning, the Suleiman Great on the 16th century when he started it all. So that's when it started to develop into a different kind of thing. As I said before, the early taverns did not have like a social life. That was not the point. It was like a rest in. Get your coffee, you rest in, and you continue. How it developed after that, once Serbia got independent and things like that, is it started to be kafanas or kahvehane. That is a word from Turkish. I don't know if, Arabic. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly. Probably not. So I'm gonna stick to the Serbian term. It's kafana. So back home, kafanas were basically the taverns that we know, the traditional taverns that started to be about coffee, but also wine, teas and stuff like that. But it wasn't even that. It was a very important segment of the social thing that started to be about after the whole collapse of the empire and after like countries started to be independent. So at the time, how it rose and how it got into, like, there were like taverns in the late 19th century. So in 1893, Taverna Kolarac actually had its first book, fair. So taverns from like a resting point of salesmen, tradesmen, and soldiers came to be about a social interaction, a place where intellectuals met. At the time, I'm talking about Serbia, but also, like as I said, the 17th century Europe took away from those taverns and started to make it cafes and started to make it into something different. Obviously, it was an improvement. So basically, at the time, they had a lot of political connotations in the name. Like for instance, in Serbia, you had the Queen of Greece, you had the Russian Tsar, things like that. So basically, in the names of the taverns, you can see the political wave and what was actually going on. So the names of the taverns were affected by that. We also had two pigeons, and then you would have like things like names like that resemble also a different sphere, not just the politics field, but mostly it was about that. Intellectuals were a lot hanging out. It was a place of changing information. I'm just talking about Europe now. We're gonna touch base about US and the Pilgrims and the Caribbeans in the next classes to come. So basically, it was the first phone booth where I come from in Serbia came from a tavern. So that kind of you can kind of get a picture of how important that is, because from taverns it was the newspapers were sold there, intellectuals were hanging out there. So basically all the information was there, and what it started to be is the bartender was the keeper of that place, right? Owner of the tavern, not the owner of the tavern, maybe son of the tavern owner or a relative, or it doesn't really matter in what form it was ran, or maybe an employee, but basically the barkeep was the person that tended that whole establishment, right? So he was the person that was actually listening to the intellectuals and getting to know them, and actually getting to know a lot of news, a lot that was going on, a lot of newspapers that were delivered to the tavern, and not yet a bar called. So we can see the transition between now. Maybe you're getting the point why we touched on Ottoman Empire, why that was so important, was because we kind of have to understand the beginning of it all, but it's also nice to see the development of it through time. It just goes to show, not just in the bartending world, but like in the craft, or just like how things kind of switched and drifted. I think it's important, especially in this time, that we kind of maybe touch base on a topic we normally maybe wouldn't, or would be less interested in, or whatever the place may be. So I hope you guys are, taking something from this, enjoying as well, and maybe getting your mind off other things. So this is what was basically happening in Europe at the time. So the taverns were rising and everything else, and then the pilgrims, obviously, which is a big point of what was going on, and the European settlers, is how the transition from like European taverns and cafes went into that period when like the pilgrims and would actually like start coming to Americas, right? So basically, beer is also a big segment of the history of bartending, and we're all gonna kind of intertwine and get all this into one big picture. So basically, when they came, the native Indians in America were already making a fermented drink that was similar to beer, which was called chicha. So chicha is basically a corn beer. Corn beer that's very popular in Latin America as well, and so was it popular in our region now as well. So it's not as if the European settlers actually brought in the beer to Americas at the time. So the Indians were actually doing it, and one of the first written records of that was in 1587. The native Indian fermented drink that was beer that we called in. So we have to keep in mind, why did the pilgrims actually come, and the European settlers? So basically they were obviously looking for a better life, but they were also looking for fertile land and hoping they're gonna find it here. Because if you can find fertile land, of course you need fertile land to survive. So they were looking for fertile land to actually like plant their base and actually settle and start making a new life, right? So once they came in, and obviously beer was here at the time, it was very important for that kind of segment to start. Once it developed and it grew more, and basically, you know, the English were kind of involved in Americas and in this area as well to speed forward a bit. Obviously, at the time, pale ales. So all beers were basically dark beers, ales. Lagers came later into the equation, which we'll talk a bit about that later. So basically, once the European settlers came into America, it was mostly ales that were consumed. So basically, dark beers were very popular, and that was also one of the main ingredients that people drank. Keep in mind, water at the time was of very was a very suspicious quality. So people were turned to beer and fermented drinks to drink. Keep in mind as well that locally the beer was consumed. Why? Because in order to transport beer, you would need time, right? And it's gonna go bad fast. So at the time, beer was mostly made, you know, locally and consumed and distributed locally. Whatever region you may find in the east, you know, or west, as soon as the exports like came to be. So basically, that's what was going on. It was locally, and what happened, Sean? We good?
Yep. It was 14.
14 minutes? Okay. Thanks, bro. As we said, ales were consumed then. So there was a point of that period where obviously the whole sugar expansion, which we're gonna hopefully touch base tomorrow, was obviously, you know, driven by, and all the globalization was driven by wealth. So there was wealth in beer as well, as with sugar and other things, cacao, coffee, etc., tea. So what was going on is basically the English were promoting their beer and that style, and not letting basically the domestic economy grow on their produce. And that's when one of the things that George Washington did was support domestic consumption, so consumption of local beer, and just trying to keep that local beer growing. Beer was very important at the time, and beer was considered the national drink. Beer was a very, very important staple in the American culture. So as beer grew, beer gardens came to be about. So beer gardens came to be about, and that's where they're touching the change from like taverns and cafes to like beer gardens, and how it all came to be about. So basically, in the beginning, the beer gardens were operating not so much and not so popular because people had the social life was done in factories. So basically, the beer consumption and the hangouts and the social life of everybody was done in factories where they worked. So the culture of basically going out and enjoying a drink with your friend at a beer garden or a salon at the time wasn't as big. So it wasn't as big. It just came to be about after. After a lot of things changed, and obviously with the invention of the lager, a lot of things changed. So Pilsen invented the lager in Austria, obviously, and then once the lager came to be about, so people were using caves or tunnels, anything underneath that had a low temperature to basically cool down the beer and keep it at a good temperature. So lagers had an extended shelf life versus the ales. So that's a very, very big moment in the life of the tavern and in the life of the salon as well. Keep in mind, so basically the Barkeep craft we're gonna touch base tomorrow, because tomorrow we're gonna touch base on like the taverns and where they were situated and what was so great about the location of the taverns and what was the job of the Barkeep at the time. So today we're just gonna end this with just an intro, what we're gonna be talking about tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow, I hope, yeah. So we're just gonna touch base about Marco Polo first writings in the 13th century, where sugar wine is first time mentioned. So that's when we see this transition into Europe and Marco Polo actually kind of bringing this whole popularity, not just popularity, but this new thing called sugar wine. So we're gonna stop at that. Yes, we didn't want to take too much of your time, so I hope you guys enjoyed and we took a bit of your imagination somewhere else. So yeah, so tomorrow we'll touch base again with some new things, and we're gonna continue the Barkeep history of bartending part 2 tomorrow. So I hope you guys had a good time, and I'll see you tomorrow. Ciao guys, ciao.